not every tank earned its reputation from the enemy. Some of the most feared vehicles in the Second World War were feared by the men who were supposed to operate them. These are the tanks that crews nicknamed, complained about in formal reports, refused when they could, and drove when they could not. 10 tanks, 10 decisions that command made and crews absorbed. 1. Tiger IS, Germany, 1942. The Tiger I carried the most feared anti-tank gun of the Second World War in a hull that could not reliably reach the battlefield under its own power. It weighed 57 tons, mounted an 80mm KWK 36 gun capable of defeating any Allied tank at combat range, and moved at 38 km/h on road when every component was functioning correctly. The qualification was critical. The Tiger's Maybach HL 230 engine produced 700 horsepower and transmitted that power through a pre-selector gearbox of such complexity that training new drivers required weeks rather than days. The final drive units that converted engine power into track movement were under-engineered for the vehicle's weight and failed under sustained operational use with a consistency that German maintenance units documented in detail. At Kursk, in 1943, Tiger formations that covered 100 kilometers on their own tracks arrived with vehicles already requiring maintenance that field workshops could not provide. Crews who reported mechanical failures were sometimes accused of cowardice. The accusation required ignoring the maintenance logs that supported every report. The Tiger's 80-bay Minute gun made it the most dangerous tank on any battlefield it reached. The question its crews learned to ask was not whether the Tiger could defeat the enemy. It was whether the Tiger could reach the enemy before the final drive failed. 2. Covenanter, United Kingdom, 1940. Britain's Covenanter was a cruiser tank whose cooling system was positioned so far from the engine it was designed to cool that the two components could not perform their functions simultaneously under operational conditions. It weighed 18 tons, mounted a 2-pounder gun, and carried its 4-man crew in a vehicle whose engine overheated with such consistency that British tank crews training on Covenanters in Scotland, one of the coldest operational environments available, reported coolant temperatures reaching critical levels within 30 minutes of sustained movement. The radiators were mounted at the front of the hull. The engine was mounted at the rear. The coolant lines connecting them ran the full length of the vehicle and lost thermal efficiency across that distance at a rate the designers had not adequately calculated. In hot weather, the Covenanter became uninhabitable before it became combat ineffective. Crews training in southern England during summer reported that internal temperatures made sustained operation physically dangerous. The British Army identified the cooling problem before the Covenanter entered full production. Production continued regardless, on the basis that the vehicle was needed for training and that combat deployment could be avoided. Every Covenanter that was built was used for training. None were sent to combat theatres. The crews who trained in them understood why before they finished their first exercise. 3. FCM-36, France, 1936. France designed the FCM-36 as an infantry support tank, a vehicle intended to advance alongside foot soldiers at walking pace and suppress opposition with its armament. It weighed 12.3 tons, mounted a 30mm gun in a 1-man turret, and carried its 2-man crew in a vehicle that represented several genuine engineering advances over its contemporaries. Welded rather than riveted armour, a diesel engine that reduced fire risk, and sloped armour that increased effective protection beyond its measured thickness. None of these advantages compensated for the 1-man turret that required the commander to aim, load, and fire, while simultaneously maintaining awareness of a battlefield he could observe only through restricted vision ports. During the Battle of France in 1940, FCM-36 crews attempting to engage German armour discovered that the cognitive demand of the one-man turret extended their engagement times to the point where German crews had identified, aimed, and fired before the FCM-36 commander had completed the loading cycle. France produced 100 FCM-36 tanks. Their crews submitted after-action reports that described the one-man turret as the vehicle's primary liability. The reports were accurate. They were also too late. The Battle of France lasted 6 weeks. The FCM-36 crews who submitted those reports did so from captivity. 4. T-60, Soviet Union, 1941. The Soviet T-60 was a light tank that Soviet crews renamed with a phrase that translates approximately as mass grave for two. It weighed 6.4 tons, carried a 20mm autocannon that could not defeat German medium armour at any range, and provided its two-man crew with armour measuring 20mm at maximum, sufficient to stop rifle fire and nothing else that the Germans deployed in 1941. The T-60 was designed and produced because the Soviet Union had lost the majority of its pre-war tank inventory during the first months of Operation Barbarossa and needed armour in numbers that only a small, simple vehicle could provide quickly. Soviet factory workers who had been producing agricultural equipment were retrained to build T-60 tanks in weeks. The result was a vehicle that could be manufactured rapidly, transported easily, and deployed in the numbers the front required. What it could not do was survive contact with German armour. Soviet crews who received T-60 tanks instead of T-34s submitted requests for reassignment through channels that had no mechanism to process them. The requests were denied. The T-60s were sent forward. Soviet after-action reports from 1941 and 1942 document T-60 engagements with German Panzer IIIs and IVs in language that does not obscure the outcome. The vehicle that Soviet workers built in weeks to replace the tanks lost in days lasted approximately as long in combat. 5. Type 94 TK, Japan, 1934. Japan's Type 94 TK was a tankette, a category of vehicle that the Imperial Japanese Army classified as a tank, and that the crews inside it experienced as something closer to a sealed metal box with a machine gun. It weighed 3.4 tons, carried a single 6.5mm machine gun, and provided its two-man crew with interior dimensions so constrained that sustained operation required both men to maintain fixed positions for hours, in temperatures that the uninsulated steel hull amplified in tropical climates to the point of incapacitation. Japanese medical records from Pacific operations document heat casualties among Type 94 TK crews that occurred before the vehicles had made contact with any opponent. The machine gun it carried could suppress unprotected infantry. Against any armoured vehicle, against any crew-served weapon, against any fixed defensive position with overhead cover, it was tactically irrelevant. Japanese commanders who deployed Type 94 TKs against American positions in the Pacific were deploying a vehicle designed for operations against Chinese irregular forces in Manchuria, into engagements against Marines equipped with anti-tank rifles, 50 caliber machine guns, and artillery. The Type 94's armour stopped nothing the Americans fired at it. Its machine gun stopped nothing the Americans put in its path. It was deployed regardless, because Japan had nothing else available in the numbers the campaign required, and a campaign requirement that cannot be met with adequate equipment is met with whatever exists. 6. A-10 Cruiser, Mk II, United Kingdom, 1940. Britain designed the A-10 as a heavy cruiser, a designation that implied greater protection than the standard cruiser tanks of the period, and delivered armour measuring 30mm at maximum. Sufficient against rifle fire and light machine guns, insufficient against the 37mm of anti-tank guns that constituted the standard German anti-armour weapon in 1940. The A-10 weighed 13.9 tons, mounted a 2-pounder gun, and carried its 3-man crew in a vehicle whose armour the War Office had classified as infantry tank standard in procurement documents, and whose combat performance in France demonstrated that the classification was aspirational rather than accurate. At the Battle of France, A-10 formations encountered German anti-tank positions and discovered that 30mm of armour at standard engagement distances provided protection for approximately the duration of the first hit. British crews who survived initial penetrations reported that the interior fragmentation produced by 30mm rounds striking the hull was as dangerous as the round itself. Steel splinters from the inner armour face travelling at velocities sufficient to kill crew members who had not been struck by the penetrating projectile. The A-10 was withdrawn from frontline service after France. It had served in the only campaign available to it, and demonstrated in that campaign every limitation its specifications had implied. The crews who identified those limitations in France did so in the only way available to them. 7. Cromwell Mk I, United Kingdom, 1943. Britain's Cromwell was, in its later variants, among the most capable British tanks of the war, fast, mechanically reliable, and adequately armed for the engagements it fought in northwest Europe. The Mk I variant that preceded those later versions carried a different engine configuration and a fuel system whose placement created fire risks that British crews identified and reported before the variant reached operational deployment. The Rolls-Royce Meteor engine that powered the Cromwell produced 600 horsepower and gave the tank a road speed of 64 km/h, making it the fastest British tank of the war. The fuel system that supplied that engine was positioned in proximity to exhaust components that ran at temperatures sufficient to ignite petrol vapour under conditions that sustained high-speed movement reliably produced. British crews who trained on early Cromwells reported fuel system fires during exercises at rates that maintenance records documented and that should have triggered design review before operational deployment. The Mk I's fuel placement was modified in subsequent variants. The modification confirmed that the problem crews had reported was real. The confirmation arrived after the crews who had reported it had already operated the unmodified version in conditions where a fuel fire was not a training inconvenience but a combat casualty. 8. Panzerkampfwagen 35T, Germany 1939. Germany inherited the Panzer 35T from Czechoslovakia and deployed it through the Polish and French campaigns with results adequate enough to defer the recognition of its fundamental vulnerability. The hydraulic steering and braking system that controlled the vehicle performed within acceptable parameters in the temperate conditions of Poland and France. On the Eastern Front, in the winter of 1941, those parameters ceased to apply. The hydraulic fluid that the steering system required to function thickened in temperatures below -15 degrees Celsius to the point where the system could not generate sufficient pressure to operate. A Panzer 35T crew in a Russian winter that had dropped below the hydraulic fluid's operational threshold was operating a tank that could accelerate and stop but could not turn. The tactical implications of a tank that cannot change direction in combat require no elaboration. German crews on the Eastern Front submitted reports describing complete loss of steering control during winter operations, with a frequency that unit war diaries recorded, without apparent urgency at higher command levels. The Panzer 35T was withdrawn from frontline service in 1942. The withdrawal followed a full Russian winter, during which its crews had operated a vehicle whose steering system the temperature had disabled and whose replacement had not yet arrived. 9. M22 Locust, United States, 1944. America designed the M22 Locust to be delivered by glider to airborne operations, a concept that required the tank to weigh no more than 7.4 tons and accept the structural compromises that weight limit imposed. It mounted a 37mm gun, carried a 3-man crew, and provided armour measuring 25mm at maximum. The same protection level that American 50 caliber machine guns had already demonstrated they could defeat at combat ranges against Japanese vehicles in the Pacific. The Locust's combat debut came at Operation Varsity in March 1945. The Rhine crossing that represented the largest single-day airborne operation of the war. Of the 8 M22 Locust tanks committed to the operation, several were damaged during landing before they could be made operational. Those that reached the ground intact faced German anti-tank weapons that the 25mm armour did not survive. American airborne commanders who had requested the Locust for the mobility and fire support it was supposed to provide discovered that a tank light enough to be delivered by glider was light enough to be defeated by weapons the infantry it was supporting also faced. The M22 Locust was declared obsolete before the war ended. The declaration confirmed what the Rhine operation had demonstrated, that the weight constraints required to make a tank deliverable by air in 1944 made it inadequate for the combat environment it was delivered into. 10. Comet I, United Kingdom, 1944. Britain introduced the Comet in the final months of the war as a response to the German Panzer and Tiger tanks that had outclassed British armour since 1942. It weighed 35.7 tons, mounted a 70mm gun derived from the 17-pounder that could defeat Panther frontal armour at combat ranges, and carried its 5-man crew in protection adequate against most German anti-tank weapons below 88mm caliber. The Comet was, by the standards of 1944, a genuinely capable tank. It was also 2 years late. British crews who received Comets in late 1944 and early 1945 were operating a vehicle that addressed the problems their predecessors had died inside between 1942 and 1944. The Cromwells and Churchills and Valentines that had faced Panthers and Tigers with inadequate guns and insufficient armour between Normandy and the Rhine had established the tactical conditions that the Comet was designed to correct. The correction arrived when the campaign had already consumed the crews who had needed it most. The Comet's combat record in the final weeks of the war was excellent. It demonstrated what British armour might have achieved if the vehicle that entered service in November 1944 had entered service in November 1942. The crews who received it in 1944 knew the difference. The crews who had needed it in 1942 were not present to receive it. 10 tanks, 10 institutional decisions made above the level of the crew and absorbed at the level of the crew. The Tiger I's final drives, the Covenanter's cooling lines, the FCM-36's 1-man turret, the T-60's 20mm gun, the Type 94's sealed heat, the A-10's fragmenting armour, the Cromwell's fuel lines, the Panzer 35T's hydraulic fluid, the Locust's 25mm protection, the Comet's 2-year delay, each one a decision that someone made in an office and someone else absorbed in a tank. The records show what the decisions were. The names in the casualty lists show who absorbed them. If there is a tank you believe deserved a place on this list, leave it in the comments. For more military history told without omission, subscribe. We will see you in the next one.